What are Canada's provincial governments saying about tech? And what are they willing to pay for? Hello and welcome to another episode of the BetaKit Podcast. I am Douglas Altus, Editor-in-Chief of BetaKit. My co-host, as always, is Rob Kennedy. We're always eager on this podcast to track the impact our governments have on Canadian tech and innovation, for good and ill. But this week, we're not looking at the national level, but province by province. Both BC and Alberta have released their provincial budgets, and both contain commitments that affect Canadian tech and those provinces' local tech ecosystems. But what is the impact? As a member of the Toronto media elite, I'm not qualified to say. Thankfully, our friends at CCI, the Council of Canadian Innovators, are on the podcast this week, and they've been very busy layering provincial presence on top of their national lens. So Benjamin Bergen, now CCI's president, joins with Bronte Valk, CCI's government relations manager in Edmonton, to break down what they liked and didn't like from each budget. But we also go back to that first question. What impacts can provincial governments have on tech, and how do local ecosystems impact their governments? The last point is particularly important given, as CCI tells us, apparently the provinces don't talk to each other on points of policy, which is crazy, but timely given, as CCI tells us, BC is showing signs that the local government is finally ready to get serious about IP and data strategy. That comes shortly after Alberta is putting out RFPs for their own IP and data strategy. Oh, and then there's the 2/3 of Canada's population still waiting for their budgets in Ontario and Quebec. But we'll get to that. Let's dig in. Thank you both for joining us today. And I think before we dig into our favorite topic on this podcast, which is like the most insidery baseball league conversations we can have about government innovation and federal spending, or I guess government spending, we should probably break down, as I do my own Freudian slip, the role that provincial governments play when it comes to impact on innovation across Canada. The last time BetaKit or this podcast was fundamentally focused on this question, it was 2018, 2019, and that's because provinces across Canada were very dramatically cutting on tech spend, and it was having an impact on local incubators, accelerators, and I think BC particularly was upset that it didn't have its own dedicated economic development division, which I think has now been course corrected, but was causing them quite a bit of stress as it came to like allocation of spending towards tech initiatives. Since then, this COVID thing happened, and I think every Canadian learned, for better or worse, how impactful or not provincial governments could be. I think this is a really good time to cleanse the palate a bit and just talk about like what role do provincial governments play on the various tech hubs across Canada? Ben, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, no, I'll jump in. So at the Council of Canadian Innovators, obviously our main focus when we first got going was to start on federal public policy. But as we kind of continued down sort of the rabbit hole of the things that needed to be accomplished, increasingly what's being determined is that the provinces have a tremendous amount of agency and power in terms of determining what's occurring within their jurisdiction.
Municipal elections.
Yeah, municipal elections. But thinking about things like health data, thinking about things like education and retraining, thinking about tech transfer offices in universities and what's happening with IP.
Procurement even.
Procurement. Yeah, procurement's a huge one. Thank you. But in order to really be able to shape the tech ecosystem, you have to be looking at federal policies and increasingly also provincial policies. And we actually have Bronte Valk joining us today, who's CCI's representative in Alberta. And the catalyst that actually brought CCI to Alberta was actually potential changes back in, was it 2019 or 2020, Bronte, that were going to change some of the SHRED credits that they were looking at. There was huge concern in the Alberta tech ecosystem and a desire to really realize that folks needed to organize, needed to come together and really push the Kenny government at the time to make sure to include those types of changes.
Was that around SHRED specifically, Bronte, or just also the angel investment credit that I think literally everyone in Alberta freaked out about it once in a unified voice?
For sure. So there were 3 credits that were eliminated. There was SHRED, and that was reintroduced actually in the last year and a half, I want to say. It's now called the Innovation Employment Grant. There was a digital media tax credit that was eliminated and it wasn't reintroduced, and also the investors tax credit that hasn't been introduced either yet.
So that's a good corollary as well. The impact, I guess, of these ecosystems on potentially changing governments' minds as towards policy, which again, we've specifically been focused on at a federal level and had CCI participate in those conversations. I think probably one of the most interesting ones there was maybe 2015, 2016, when the NDP platform was doing some very interesting things as regards to how they were going to tax venture investments. But at a provincial level as well, this can be just as impactful. Is there anything else that we should consider when it comes to provincial oversight or implementation of innovation broadly?
Yeah, so I think the other element is also provincial governments are a bit like incubators in terms of public policy. Some move forward on some topics faster than others. So, as an example, BC was kind of the first region to have a provincial nominee program for the tech ecosystem, right? And through that, we've been able to get other provinces to adopt similar measures. And we're beginning to see similar things in areas like federal or provincial IP strategy, right? So Ontario is actually leading policy in that area. And by getting other jurisdictions to follow suit, you'll be able to create sort of a better ecosystem, not just for these regions, but also federally. And I think it's a little bit analogous to healthcare in Canada, right? Saskatchewan, obviously the first province to have universal healthcare. It's that sort of incubation that occurred in sort of the provincial level. And then ultimately it gets pushed up to the federation. And then ultimately we all now have universal healthcare. So the provinces in a lot of ways are really the petri dish of where public policy can move. And given that we have such variance in who's in power, right? The socialists in British Columbia, the conservatives in Alberta, you're getting a different flavor and nuance of what that looks like through innovation policy. And by cherry picking the best ideas that are coming out of these jurisdictions and then trying to nationalize them, you're able to ultimately create a more successful and more robust ecosystem.
Okay, so before we evaluate the various petri dishes, Bronte, was there anything you wanted to add there from your perspective kind of on the ground?
I guess one thing that was left out is we still have provincial immigration programs. And so, one thing that CCI was really happy about here is that we got an accelerated tech pathway. And so that's a sort of program that tech applicants can go through to get permanent residency in like a record 6 months' time. And that was really big for the tech sector here in Alberta. So yeah, immigration is one of them. Procurement, provincial governments also give out a lot of research and development grants and use funding towards accelerators and incubators. So lots of stuff within our jurisdiction.
What about the other direction? So Benjamin, you mentioned the bottom-up approach. You experiment in the province, and the healthcare is actually a perfect example because a lot of the federal tax dollars go into healthcare budgets nationally, and then that drops down to the provinces, and the provinces have to allocate that money within the province because the provinces set healthcare policy and a bunch of other education policy, and a bunch of other stuff. How do the provincial budgets traditionally staple themselves to the federal budget or not when it comes to innovation policy?
On that, where you often see alignment and where you see that sort of coupling is often around expenditures, right? So matching, let's say, SHRED funding at provincial levels, matching, grants. You've really seen in jurisdictions like British Columbia where the federal government has come in and decided to allocate, hundreds of millions of dollars towards clean tech. You see provincial governments then match those dollars to try and get more bang for their buck. So I would say the federal government's main area where you're seeing that that pairing is around sort of funding models. I think the federal government's actually been quite slow, and maybe this is something we can dive into, has been quite slow on some of the regulatory changes that have really been required over the last number of years. Now, I'm willing to give them, a bit of slack, obviously, global pandemic and some of these other concerns, but it really is actually at the provincial level that you're seeing more of kind of the regulatory changes, obviously the sexiest things that is innovation policy happening at that jurisdiction level and less so federally.
Is that because we have actual few provincial or national regulators compared to some of the provincial organizations that seem to cluster together, like the OSC and its ilk through the CSA regulating security law, where there is no actual national oversight? They kind of come together as a consortium to just figure stuff out.
Yeah, so I think it obviously just has to do with the way that the federation is actually structured, right? So the fact that healthcare, which is, obviously been such a massive piece, is structured provincially, that is where you're seeing changes on things like privacy and data sharing, right? So I think it's just where sort of the heft of the actual policies reside that you're seeing the need for changes and those policy shifts. Where I would say that the federal government has been on the sort of slower side, I think has really been on some of these kind of more grand pronouncements. So federal government's been talking now for over a year about changes on open banking, and nothing has moved there. We recently published a letter yesterday.
Was it a letter? Or was it really like a per our last letter? What the hell's going on over the last 18 months? Yeah, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was a letter, and it's really calling on Parliamentary Secretary Randy Boissonnault to really look at, where is this in terms of
what's in their mandate
to
do
exactly.
something?
Yeah, what's in their mandate letter for sure. Okay. Yeah,
I was going to save this for the back end as a special bonus, but because we've broached it, we might as well also talk about. There's also a lot of conversations on the federal government kind of re-announcing their budgeted commitment, the $4 billion digital adoption program, which seems to be receiving a lot of coverage in the Globe and Mail recently from all sides of. Apparently, it is a program that is both servicing the interests of global tech giants and furthering this branch plant economy, but then also too focused on Canadian students and their employment opportunities. Is that also like maybe by comparison how it seems as though since the beginning of Twitter, at least, arguments over how governments allocate their spending and towards what cause furious debate?
Yeah. So, I mean, to sort of dive in it from our perspective, which obviously you and your listeners are
should know here. Yeah, I'm referring to Jim Balsilli's comments in the Globe and Mail, who happens to be is one of the chairmen of the CCI.
Yeah, he's our chair. Obviously, supporting domestic innovators is key. And I think the program laid out by the federal government to try and assist with the digitization of smaller businesses through the digital adoption program is beneficial for those firms, right? It'll help them modernize and hopefully, be more competitive. But where we really sort of need to get more bang for our buck is how is that adoption actually going to occur? So of the $15,000 that's being allocated towards, social media and other assistance areas, where are those dollars going to be spent? They're overwhelmingly going to be spent on Facebook, and they're going to be overwhelmingly spent at Google. And so as this program is being created, definitely positive on the small business side. And, let's not besmirch any of those people that have really been struggling because of COVID and the challenges. But we've got to make sure that the spend that we're doing is also being smart from a building capacity perspective of our own domestic innovators. So making sure that companies like obviously Shopify and Lightspeed and Vendesta can actually participate in terms of being able to help these businesses modernize and be able to compete. Because ultimately, if those dollars are just flowing to kind of the usual suspects, we're not getting the biggest bang for our buck. And procurement and how Canadians purchase really is a huge multiplier in terms of the creation of firms, in wealth creation, and ultimately going to help us pay, for the over $400 billion that we spent on COVID relief over the last kind of 18 months. So that's, I think, where our chair's comments came down critical of the government, saying, great that you're supporting these businesses, but you've really got to be smarter with your dollar allocation because we do have a finite amount of money that we can actually spend.
Yeah, I think that's a good statement of defense from CCI's perspective. And, we've obviously covered the procurement topic, I think pretty extensively when you've been on, but also in its many articulations through just the difficulties around PPE and things like that on this podcast related to COVID. But I also think that your framing there is really important. And I think a good setup for us to then now dig into the provincial budgets, whereas it's not only about what is being committed or not committed, it's also an evaluation along the lens of how that's being implemented and maybe how best or how in which ways it would be better for that money to be utilized. It's not necessarily evaluating the initial commitment, but that opportunity cost of every other possible implementation, which I think is maybe a strong way for us to dig into both the BC and the Alberta budgets that have been laid out. Because as we were told from one super savvy insider, it seemed as though these budgets were a study in contrast where everything the tech ecosystem wanted was in one budget, and then the other budget was exceptionally not that. And I'm wondering, before we dig into that, how CCI views that, or compare and contrast, because I guess the unsophisticated reader of this stuff would be like, oh yeah, provincial commitments for these things. But what is the lens that maybe CCI is seeing this through? And I guess, Bronte, let's get you in, because you're representing one of the provinces here. And I would love to know if your province was the super cool, got everything that we wanted province, or the province.
Oh, we were the super cool province.
Okay. Unbiased opinion, I think.
That would have been bad booking on our part if it went the other way. So I'm glad that was the answer. And then I guess explain to our listeners why that's the case, why Albertans are over the moon right now.
Honestly, talking to members, the number one issue that they've said to us that their companies face with scaling is access to talent. And what we saw in the 2022 budget was there's a huge talent emphasis on it. So what there was they called it the Alberta at Work initiative, which was essentially $600 million over 3 years to assist Albertans in participating in the labor market. So there was huge investments when it came to things like increasing the amount of computer science seats in universities. Increasing the amount of retraining and reskilling programs. There's, more money that goes to micro-credential programs and skills development. A lot of the things that we highlighted actually in our pre-budget submission to government were things that we actually got. So there is, funding allocated towards the province's data strategy. We've been advocating for that for, quite some time here. There was money that was going to Alberta Innovation and Technology Strategy. And I just saw last Thursday, part of that Alberta Innovation and Technology Strategy is going to be the creation of an IP framework. So the government put an RFP out actually on Thursday on the IP framework. So these are all things we're really excited about. And that's why it made Alberta's budget so great.
An IP framework being CCI's love language, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, Doug, I was going to jump in there and tease you. I mean, the fact that we got a Kenny government to, talk about or work towards provincial IP strategy, I think is huge. That really has been a lot of the work that Bronte has done over the last number of years in terms of accomplishments. And so that's part of the reason why it's super cool as a jurisdiction. If we're turning to British Columbia, why BC is currently not super cool is they do not have an IP strategy.
Okay. Because you said the K word. How much of this budget could possibly be impacted by the current crisis in Ukraine and global macro socio-political circumstances? We literally just had a wonderful conversation last week about the impact of some of those considerations on just the very insulated Canadian VC ecosystem. When we're talking about transforming Alberta's labor force and a focus on things moving away from natural resources, how locked in is a budget and commitment to that versus the changing headwinds of like the next political catastrophe, or I swear to God, the pipeline conversations that I've been reading about in US media as it relates to Canada have just been making like my eyes actually roll forward again after going around my head.
On the budget side, that's locked in. So pleased on that front. I think where things are often a bit dicey in Alberta is that when obviously oil rises, the coffers of the government increases, and concerns for other sectors of the economy often dissipate because they are in sort of the
boom time
boom time or rolling in the money, as you kind of put it. That said, I do feel like the language that we've heard from some of the key ministers in the province, whether it be Minister Glubich, whether it be Minister Schweitzer, is really committed to building out this sector. The volatility in the commodities market based on the geopolitics of the world, I think, are so unstable that there is a real desired commitment to continuing to make sure that this sector grows. And I think over the last number of years, you've also seen a more engaged ecosystem with strong member companies really wanting to participate in that conversation. And I think Bronte has done a good job in terms of galvanizing those people. So I think there is always that concern that, if oil remains at $100 a barrel, that you could see sort of that focus be diminished. But I do think that we are living in a slightly different reality given the geopolitics that we find ourselves in. And I actually think the consequences of what's happening in sort of the global order will actually lead to potentially a doubling down of some of the main themes that CCI has been advocating for years, which is government procurement of domestic innovators, because we need to have our own capacity in case of crisis. We saw this with PPE around healthcare. I think increasingly we're going to be seeing this in defense. And, maybe this is slightly a teaser for the federal budget comment, but I think you're going to see this capacity in defense. But I also think that you're going to see it in areas like cybersecurity as well. And making sure that we have regulatory frameworks that allow us to have built capacity will be critical. So I think that we're entering sort of a whole new world in terms of what innovation policy will look like, given the instability of Ukraine, global pandemic, and the other crises that we're facing.
Okay, I just want to challenge your optimism there for a second. I know it was your birthday yesterday at time of recording.
Yeah.
But particularly when it comes to PPE, the current circumstance of that is that we haven't learned any lessons and procurement's still a disaster. The commentary on the $4 billion program we're just talking about notes that there's a lack of Canadian companies being procured. And I believe The Logic just ran a story yesterday, the other day, about how we're doing on the vaccination stand front and certain agreements that have yet to be signed after being months after being announced. Where is that optimism coming from, I guess?
Being a Pisces? Okay. No, I think...
You just won the argument. I got no defense against that as a Virgo.
No, I think that where we're beginning to see green shoots is in some of the public policy conversations that are happening. And I think when you look at the federal landscape, the creations of things like the Innovation Asset Collective, I think is part of that. I think you do see commitment by the federal government to create an economic advisory council that hopefully will inform and educate. So we don't do boneheaded procurement systems and that we don't squander government funding, right? So I think that there are some sort of green shoots that we're seeing at the federal level. But I think where we're really seeing some opportunities is at the provincial level. And I actually think we're seeing it from jurisdictions that I think would maybe surprise some of the listeners. I think a lot of interesting things are happening in Ontario around Ford's government, which I think are real indicators that an understanding of the innovation economy is actually critical. So my optimism continues. I think when we had this conversation 5 years ago, when I talked about foreign direct investment in the innovation space potentially having negative spillovers, everyone thought that I had three heads. And now you're actually seeing that being discussed openly by ministers, by government officials, and a real desire to build domestic capacity. Public policy takes years to change. There is optimism for what can be accomplished.
It's funny that you brought up a couple points ago, something we brought up in our last episode with RBC, the venture team there, about, hey, look, oil is a thing now. So don't focus on the natural resources. Keep focusing on the innovation stuff. But we've also seen a lot of commitments, at least intentional or anticipatory commitments from a budget perspective at the provincial level, sometimes at the federal level, but even the provincial level, about here's the things we're going to do. That's fantastic, but have we actually seen provinces actually follow through on their commitments and actually spend the money that they've allocated in the way that they've anticipated? And how do we make sure that that does happen?
Yeah, for sure. So I think at a provincial level, there was a lot of funding that was dedicated in the last budget to accelerators and incubators. And there was an RFP that went out for them. We have Plug and Play now. We have some other global accelerators as well that are stationed here. Whatever government is promising in the budgets when it comes to funding for these innovation items, they're definitely delivering on.
Is that common across all provinces or even nationally? I know there's been issues before with FedDev or IRAP funding kind of being held. And I know there's a huge issue right now in Ontario as it relates to kind of COVID emergency spending that just didn't happen, which seems absolutely ridiculous. I know that's outside of your spectrum there, but is it a general rule of government that for the most part budgets are spent through? Like any sort of context you could provide for our listeners would be helpful, because I'm sure most of them are coming at it from a business perspective, and anyone who's worked in large enterprise knows that like the worst thing you can do at a corporation is not spend through your budget, because that means that you never get that level of budget again. But I'm not sure how that plays federally or provincially from the government perspective.
Look, I think the last 2 years have been kind of wild anomalies where you've seen billions of dollars flow out of federal and provincial governments. And so we can't really use those as baselines because they are so kind of unique. But I think if you look back at 2019, as an example, SHRED program was allocated around sort of the $3 billion mark. That amount of money flowed. So there is a consistency to spend what are in your coffers when you look at something like FedDev, or you look at Pacifican or some of the other regional economic development agencies. They traditionally do spend all of their dollars. They get them out in sort of accordance with timelines. So
is superclusters the outlier there then when it comes to federal programs that impact our ecosystem?
Yeah. So the beloved superclusters. I think that that structure, in terms of how it was designed, I think made it challenging for dollars to flow based on it being program specific, and ultimately it became sort of detached from its sort of original purpose and focus. And so some of those dollars ended up being allocated towards COVID projects. They were supposed to be based on sort of this regional heightening or enhancing of specific regions. So BC being digital, Montreal sort of being AI. And then ultimately you're seeing, projects being funded all across the country for various clusters. So that program is a bit sort of a unique one in terms of how dollars flowed and what the structure was. So I would say it's kind of an outlier.
Okay. That's useful context, because even that regional identity component is still something that we're dealing with right now. I know that Vancouver is going through, I wouldn't say necessarily an identity crisis, but maybe like an awakening of its identity and trying to figure out what it's going to be as it's seen an explosion of funding. And we just published a story today, 2,000 words on how the province of BC is trying to become a clean tech leader. Now, one of the commitments in their budget, or I guess maybe the only commitment that was relevant to our ecosystem, was related to clean tech. And I wonder, Ben, if that resonates along the framing that we were identifying here. I would love to hear if CCI, from your perspective, has any issues with that commitment, or is it more about the lack of commitments elsewhere?
Yeah. So on the funding piece, all well and good. That was kind of the one sort of main kind of green shoot that we saw in terms of the budget that we were supportive. I think and I actually do have some hot tips for you, Douglas, on some of the recent conversations that we've had. But where we were first disappointed with the BC budget was really just around its lack of support of an IP strategy, of a data strategy, and really some of the infrastructure that's required to make sure that we're ultimately not just subsidizing, foreign multinationals R&D, but actually building domestic capacity. When we were contrasting budgets between British Columbia and Alberta, this for us was sort of the flashing lights of concern, was that BC just was really struggling on sort of the regulatory frameworks. And more challenging to that was the fact that this was in the NDP's platform back in 2020. So the fact that they had sort of negated that for 2 years is really a concern. All of this being said, though, on Friday, I met with the Premier and a number of his key ministers, and there really does seem to be a renewed energy and focus on updating IP strategies and updating provincial data strategies as well. So modernizing PIPEDA and all those other sort of fun structures that bind and create that. And this is kind of where sort of the narrative comes in about us sharing best practices based on regions. This is where we basically came with IPON, which is something that Ontario created recently, and also the release of their digital white paper on data and privacy, and said, look, you can really crib a lot of the best practices from what's going on in Ontario. We spent time working with them on these pieces, getting innovators' input into what's really required. So you don't have to go and reinvent the wheel. You don't have to go out and really formulate all of these concepts on your own. You can really crib a lot of the best practices from what Ontario's done. And
which they would need to align with anyway due to like international, I guess, requirements for that to function, right?
For sure, definitely on things like privacy updates and some of those elements, for sure. So making sure that they're GDPR compliant. But to dive deeper on some of the IP pieces, it's basically taking the report that Ontario commissioned and really bringing forward those recommendations into their policy shop.
How well received is that? Is there a cross-pollination that happens in a peer-to-peer kind of way because you're facilitating those things? And is it like not invented here? Nope, we're going to invent our own. Thank you very much, Ontario.
And why is CCI required to carry the water of what each province is doing so that they know? Bronte's loving this because she's like, Ben's getting all the tough questions, and she's Alberta is awesome.
So okay, all right. So no, but I think
not in a malicious way. It's not meant
no. But so I think, look, here's something that I think I didn't anticipate when we began doing these conversations across provinces. They don't talk to each other. And we have often had to actually set up meetings with provincial government counterparts, which is something that I did not think that we would have to do. And this is actually quite salacious in sort of the government relations world that I'm actually revealing this. So you guys are getting
you're revealing all the secrets of the deep state. This is perfect.
It's all of the hot tea. And so that really is something that we've actually been facilitating and really trying to help move those conversations. And so connecting people within different governments. One of the things, though, that I think we've been successful as an organization is because we're national, we don't get sort of marred into some of the provincial dichotomies or narratives. And the other thing that we do is we really try and indicate that this is expert advice, not just from our membership, but from experts across the country. As an example, a lot of the really great recommendations that came out of Ontario's IPON actually come from professors and academics based in British Columbia. So this is actually a lot of BC ideas. And so when we go and speak with the British Columbia Premier, Premier Bergen, we really try and position that, yes, this is obviously coming from Ontario, but a lot of smart people within your own province are actually the ones pushing these ideas. So figuring out how to talk to different governments about these issues and how to connect them is important. And I think the other thing that's also really happened is the stuff that we're talking about actually isn't left or right anymore. What we're actually talking about is economic prosperity. And so regardless of whether you're the NDP in British Columbia or the Conservatives in Ontario, figuring this out matters. This is paramount to economic success and prosperity. How it's done and how it will be accomplished, fine, maybe there's a bit of the sort of left-right divide that gets inserted, but these concepts are actually universal and they need to be solved.
We ain't America for sure. And do you think that Bronte, since you have we're going left to right on the map, with Quebec, I think, what is it, next week, in Ontario in April, question mark.
Unless they change the laws again.
Yeah, what's the law? Are you basically going to print out what you've done in Alberta and be like, listen, and not in a mean way. It's like, listen, do you think that you can cascade those messages and those ideas and influence those budgets going across the country in a way that, like, because there's some utility to heterogeneity
CCI
in
tide,
different people.
An innovation tide sweeping across.
Totally. There is some niceties to your point, both of your points about like, hey, let's have little experiments in different provinces and see what works, and then take the best of Canada and smush them across. Is it literally just saying like, hey, this seemed to be really popular in Alberta. You'll get reelected if you do this in Ontario and Quebec. Like, is that a strategy? I don't want to get into tactics, but do you find that resonates with folks?
Honestly, every time I'm talking to government, I'm always telling them about, hey, Ontario is doing some exciting stuff with procurement. Maybe you guys should look into this sort of stuff. Like, I think it's great that we're able to get some insight in what other provinces are doing, so we can bring it to our current government. And we'd like to see it here.
I think we should stop here just to state for our listeners how appreciative we are of you coming on. Simply because, as you describe this process, the mental image that comes to my head of how government functions is like 30% Suits, 30% like a Netflix dating game. I don't know. Hopefully the rest is like an episode of The West Wing, but the work that you have to do to maybe connect the threads here is something that has been, I would say, generally obfuscated for most Canadians, and they deal with the impacts of that. So I think we really appreciate you sharing this. If not the particular strategies at work with various ministers or deputy ministers. Okay, so we should keep moving on. These budgets have already been laid out. They're boring now. We want the new hotness. We want budgets representing 50% of all Canadians approximately. We're talking about Ontario and Quebec.
Such an Ontario way of putting things. Isn't it?
Hey, I've got my Toronto media bias. I've seen the tweets from Vancouver. They have no love for me. But I think the important thing here is not only are these budgets representing large swaths of the Canadian tech ecosystem, these are also, again, keeping the provincial petri dishes in line, pre-election budgets. We have already heard, and I believe reported, if not, I'm reporting it now, from our friends in Montreal. Quebec government is essentially slow-rolling announcements that are already ready to go in terms of innovation in favor of, I'm going to use the term electioneering, broadly to lay out a pathway to election there. And Ontario literally, this has been reported, kind of broke/changed its own laws so as to delay its budget and put it right up to the finish line in terms of election day. What fresh hells await us in these provinces? How much do pre-election budgets matter in terms of platforms in service of the election, or are they actually indicative of what will happen post-election? Ben, the last time we had you on, we were talking, I believe, the day after the nothing burger of an election that we had last year. And we're look to the mandate letters. That'll be an indication of how much this government cares about what's going on. And we're also still waiting on that federal budget and the ministers, the deputy ministers to enact certain things that they said long ago they would, global crisis aside. Assuming we're not betting on this, how much should we be paying attention to this in the run up?
So great question. And I agree, Douglas, no betting. As a Mennonite, I would not be allowed to do that. So look, Ontario and Quebec are going into an election, and politicians are going to politic. And this really is where, some of the goodies are going to come from, and where you're going to see a slow rolling of policies to try and announce them as election items. I don't think that these elections are going to come down to innovation policy specifically. I don't think that these really are the center. I wish it was. I wish we were the sun and the moon, but sadly we are not. I think it's going to come down to some other key topics, right? And I do think that obviously us as an organization will definitely be holding these governments account to things that they do say, and again trying to push them to actually talk more about the innovation economy, because this is really, as I mentioned before, where wealth and prosperity comes from and where good jobs are being created, and that doubling down on this is ultimately how you're going to be able to pay for healthcare and education and the likes of these programs. So I think that what we'll see in Ontario is a budget that will really be election centric. I think it will probably come down to a lot of concerns around affordability, inflation, those types of issues as really being at the center of them. I do think that the Ontario government has moved on legislation around things like gig workers, on things like being able to, remove non-compete clauses, which, again, I think is trying to favor labor, or at least assist labor.
Are you happy with the proposed reclassification of these kind of specialized workers so that they kind of are no longer in the in-between state, but don't seem to have the same rights as a traditional employee from a CCI perspective?
Yeah, so I think I'm not a labor expert, and I often don't come at it from that specific lens, right? I really come at it from more sort of the businesses. But what I would say on the legislation is I think actually clarity is important, and I think the fact that governments or the Ontario government is actually the one leading that conversation rather than allowing it to be determined by businesses is actually really, really critical. So I think that clarity was really needed. And I think that them being the ones setting the bar on what is acceptable and not acceptable is really actually the position we want to be in as a society. It should be our governments determining these things, not the role of businesses or foreign multinationals determining who is or who is not a worker.
I think crypto bros.
Or crypto bros, yeah. So look, you might not agree with all of the nuances that are within the policy, but this is actually a step forward in pulling it into the regulatory frameworks. And if you are more left of center, then fine, you maybe push for stronger labor policies and rules to assist, or if you're on the right, the other way. But I think that it's critical that it's actually our governments determining this and not allowing this to be done to us.
Yeah. So tying that back then, just when you were talking about the BC budget commitments, it seemed like you're much more interested in frameworks being applied by these governments than, say, $500 million in strategic innovation funding, because dollar in, dollar out, whatever. But the frameworks provide that clarity and are probably a little bit longer lasting.
The thing about an innovation economy is that how you actually engineer it is where wealth and prosperity comes from, right? I'm interested in turning $1 that the provincial governments or federal governments spend into $10. I'm not interested in turning it into 10 cents. And so when you see policies like the digital tax credit that was provided by the Ministry of Small Business, what you're seeing is, some assistance in terms of helping these Main Street businesses, but you're not maximizing those dollars to allocate them towards actually helping domestic firms grow on the digital side. And so that's where I think we really need to be thinking about all of these things more deeply, is how do you build the actual infrastructure to support the dollars that you're spent being multiplied in a much larger value. We very rarely go to governments and say, hey, you need to spend more. You need to spend better, is what we often say.
We talked about Ontario. Do you have a hot take for Quebec?
They're laying out their innovation clusters all over the place as well, right?
For sure. So I think, in Quebec, it's often, a bit more kind of sophisticated in terms of sort of their approach on things. And so I think what we'll see, hopefully in the Quebec government, is a further commitment on some of the talent and skilled services. So wanting to see obviously more allocation of dollars there, I think will be a really, really critical piece. I think the provincial government hopefully will talk about Axilis and the support of an IP strategy, which they've kind of commissioned this group to sort of go forward and do. So I'm hoping that we'll see an addressing of some of the talent crisis, which Bronte brought up earlier, and probably I should have been bringing up more throughout this conversation, is the crisis around talent.
It's not just an Alberta thing.
No. This permeates everywhere, and so hopefully we'll see that really being addressed, and then hopefully we'll begin to see some of that infrastructure around how to properly spend dollars. One thing our Quebec members and the ecosystem of domestic firms is really frustrated within the province has been the supporting of foreign tech over domestic around tax subsidies. So this is where you often see, concerns around things like Ubisoft getting large tax credits that are hoovering up the talent in sort of the Montreal region. Really great article came out a couple of weeks ago in La Presse about all of the AI investments that the provincial and federal government spent in the city, and really how a lot of that research and development was ultimately squandered and didn't actually lead to the building of really successful technology companies, rest in peace, Element AI. And so what I would say is that hopefully through some of the realizations of this, we will actually see some of that infrastructure be embedded in terms of policy. Again, this is going to be a budget that's centered around election. So I don't expect us to be all the sexy headlines. It is going to be more about pocketbook issues, rising costs. But I do hope that we will see some of the things that I just highlighted there.
Bronte, is there anything else from kind of your portfolio that you'd be looking to pass around to colleagues throughout CCI to try and squeeze in as a wedge issue? It's interesting what Ben just said, because it used to be that election budgets would be about the innovation economy, and that moment seems to have passed. What from the Alberta's portfolio or commitment would you be encouraging your colleagues to, set up a meeting between a couple of deputy ministers and try to push that through?
I just think the government's support of work integrated learning programs here, and even specifically corporate-led retraining programs, often not for profits are the ones who are doing these retraining programs. But I think there's an appetite right now in government to put funding behind, local companies that have come up with their own retraining programs. Like we have Applied AI Lab that's headquartered in Calgary. They're actually a program that was developed by Alta ML, a CCI member of ours. And what they do is essentially they take people from all types of backgrounds. You can have computer science backgrounds. You can have no background at all in sort of tech, and you kind of get trained up on AI skills, and then, eventually connected with a company in the AI or ML space, or even an energy company that you could do a tech related position with. There's a lot of funding for talent here in Alberta, and I think that other provinces should probably follow in our footsteps here, considering the massive talent shortage that we're currently facing.
Where is CCI when it comes to what I'm going to call Web3 or cryptocurrencies or NFTs? I don't remember any kind of statements to that effect from CCI or any sort of public stuff. I'm wondering, are you just kind of watching and learning what some of your members might be looking to do there, or is it still too early to advocate for policy changes? Because I know the OSC, like, they're trying to figure it out. In the US, they're having like crypto Sundays or whatever, where they all get around and mint their own coin or whatever. I guess it would be interesting for our listeners to know when you get on if not the adoption cycle of a technology, the policy cycle of innovation for some of these technologies.
Couple pieces kind of there in terms of maybe how we make the sausages. Really, it's about what we're hearing in the ecosystem, predominantly from our member companies, right? In the sort of crypto space, there actually aren't that many firms that are part of CCI that focus on that particular area. So it is not sort of a hot burning issue in terms of...
Is it because there's no policy that they're running up against because there's no policy?
So I think there's a couple things. One, and this is rapidly changing. You have to be a scaling technology company. And for us, that's a revenue threshold. There are very few firms that are actually revenue positive in the space in Canada. They've raised huge amounts of money.
They're
but
Bitcoin
very few
positive, but that's not the same.
Yeah. What I would say is that has been an area where there has been sort of less kind of movement. Where I would say that we do play in this space is that obviously regulation is actually needed in order for these firms to be successful, right? If they don't know the policy environment that they're existing in, they will leave and go to other jurisdictions, right? We all know, obviously, Vitalis leaving Canada and going elsewhere. Was it just the regulatory frameworks? No, probably not. But it definitely is required that we have clarity on some of these issues. And where you begin to kind of see the Venn diagrams overlap in terms of what we care about is really in some of the open banking policies and fintech area. And that is an area where the government has been a total laggard and really has not been updating and working kind of forward on some of those pieces. So government does need to sort of kick it into high gear on what they're planning on doing. And that will then actually help to hopefully unlock some companies because this space is highly regulated in many different ways, regardless of whether the crypto bros want to admit that or not.
What do you need from Canada's innovators? I mean, you're holding the flag. Both of you are waving the flag of innovation and doing what you need to do to get people on side and get those budgets right. What do you need from Canadian innovators to actually actualize what you're advocating for? And maybe we start with Bronte as a provincial avatar and say, like, here's what we would want to do in Alberta. And of course, Alberta's just like everywhere else in Canada, wink. And then Ben, maybe we can talk about, like, what do you want your members to do to actually see traction with the promises that these budgets are making?
Yeah, for sure. So I think when I started at CCI, it was a bit kind of like herding cats. There was a bunch of people within the innovation ecosystem that were all approaching government with different talking points and different ideas. I think that the way for government to continue passing good innovation policy is if our ecosystem comes together and starts, talking from the same playbook, working together, joining CCI, coming to, our government meetings and speaking passionately on the issues that we're advocating for. I think that's a big thing.
Right. Participate. Be part of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
And Benjamin, what do you think, like, at a Canadian level? Obviously, like,
is the energy different? Obviously,
yeah.
we were kicking off before that the Alberta energy was something that was kind of like, it was a pretty firm whiplash because I think maybe some of the policy implications were more directly applicable to the day-to-day lives of the constituents.
Exactly.
Is it tougher to rally national interest, or are you again, the policy considerations are just years more down the road?
Yeah, so I think when talking about kind of innovation policy and where we want to go, it's a little bit like driving at night. We kind of know the distance or the place, the jurisdiction where we want to go, right? There's sort of this wealth, prosperity, all that kind of good stuff. And when you kind of drive, you can kind of see, a little bit in front of you in terms of, where you're ultimately going. And that really is a bit like innovation policy, right? It is not something that is some sort of, determinant. It really requires iteration, and it really requires involvement from actual innovators that are actually commercializing ideas in order to be participatory in that. You actually need to build a constituency. That constituency needs to have a voice. It needs to be able to engage and constructively talk to federal and provincial governments about a myriad of many changing landscapes that are occurring all the time, from a regulatory process, from a IP process, from a geopolitical process. This crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, to put it more clearly, has caused a tremendous shift in the way that we're looking at things, and governments needing to be responsive to that. And there's an innovation lens to this. A lot of our member companies have offices or had offices in Ukraine. And so really what is the kind of the big ask for innovators is come participate, come get involved in the work that we're doing. And, you can join and become a member of CCI. That's kind of the gold star or the platinum of what you can kind of contribute. But we do try and actually figure out other ways of getting voices into these conversations, helping to nominate people and get them onto, specific councils or boards, and really beginning to kind of build that capacity. So the kind of, way that we're going to be able to continue to shape the federal and provincial governments is through that constituency, which I've mentioned, and collectively coming together, which is really sort of what Bronte kind of iterated. And the way that you keep the sort of lights on in Ottawa in terms of focus is through that voting block. And it's through them really realizing that this is where ultimately the future is going, and where there's going to be economic opportunity. Yes, resources have swung back in Alberta, but the same thing that happened to taxi drivers in the Uberification of that industry is going to happen to oil and gas. It is going to happen to lumber. And we've got to figure out how we're going to have comprehensive data and IP strategies that will allow us to win in some of these natural resource sectors. So that's kind of my summing up of some of those points.
All right. We really appreciate you coming on and laying this out. And I guess, I don't know if we look forward to a conversation in April, depending upon how the Quebec and Ontario budgets drop out. I think we'll have to shuffle up the lineup here a little bit. Last time it was like, wait for the mandate letters. And I guess we'll keep an eye towards future budgets and see what fresh global crisis completely underscores the need for provinces across Canada.
We need to stop having you off on when there's like a crisis. Like there's always a new crisis to talk about.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah. Since we started having you on, it seems to be a never-ending string of crises. So I think we're gonna have to take that in consideration. Maybe just be the Bronte show next episode.
I would love that.
The Beta Kid podcast is produced by Beta Kid Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.